it's definitely true that you have to move quickly and you have to understand where you're fighting. Like in the Revolutionary War, let's take that. You've got Britain, they're 3,000 miles away. They send generals over, they send 32,000 troops, tremendous number of troops. But they're supposedly controlled by Britain. So if there's a problem, okay, let's put a letter on a ship. It's got to sail all the way over there.
Yeah.
They got to figure it out. They're going to put the letter back on the ship backwards saying, do this. Meanwhile, 6 months have passed, or 3
Right.
months at least.
Yeah.
And so, they can't really keep control of what's on the ground. They had no idea, the British, of what they got into when they got into the Revolutionary War.
Hark! From Jacksonville in the noble province of North Carolina, thou art now tuned to Backstage at Ten Crows Studios, a gathering of minds and muses where bold tales are told by lamp and liberty alike.
What are we going to talk about?
Film,
business, music, art,
Technology.
Podcasting from Jacksonville, North Carolina, it's Backstage at Ten Crows Studios.
Okay, so nothing crazy. This is really just a conversation. And I was actually thinking, instead of the usual intro, I might try to find some like American Revolution type music to like fade in.
Yeah, no,
fade
it sounds good. Something with drums and flutes or fifes or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah. Fife and drum corps. Do they still have that? I think that's a...
At my father's funeral, he was a veteran, they had cut the budget. So we go to the cemetery and they're supposed to have a bugler there, and two people show up, and a man and a woman, and they have bugles that they don't know how to play, and they have a tape recorder that they put behind a bush, and that's how they play taps.
I've seen, so many ceremonies I've been to, they usually have like the national anthem and other stuff on a little recorder off to the side and just play it over the even if they have a person there.
I know, it was just sort of weird because they stand there with the bugles up to their mouths, but they're just something like, it's not right, it just doesn't sound like the strength of the American military is not like with people faking that they're playing the horn. I know that they used to have buglers and they would go all over the place, but probably it was too expensive.
Yeah, I wonder if that was like a reserve unit that doesn't do it very often, or
Well, it was upstate. It was upstate New York, central New York. I think they had to come from like Rochester or something too.
That's interesting because they got Fort Drum up. Was he in the Army? Or?
Yeah, he was in the Army. Fort Drum was up north. That's like Watertown. We're about an hour and a half south of that in central New York, in Auburn, New York, where I'm from. And but we were just kind of surprised because it just was. We're trying to have the funeral, and it was. They were trying to get the tape recorder going and the technical difficulties and everything. And I don't know, it was just, it was fine. It was just comical to me. That's all. That's all.
They still did the 21 gun salute and all that?
No, they didn't. No, it was just, he got buried at a cemetery, big cemetery in town. And that was that. I mean, but it was just weird. That's all.
Oh, interesting. Was it a beautiful ceremony though?
Oh yeah, the ceremony was fine. It was just that was sort of the transistor radio version of it. That was the problem.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about you. Actually, I'll just probably easier just to let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Bob Worden, and I'm an attorney. But what I'm talking about today has very little to do with law. Basically, my job over many years was to analyze lawsuits and disputes and try and get them settled. And I also like to read a lot, and I got reading history. And then I realized that I was kind of uniquely positioned to be able to read these books and look at them from the context of like, well, why didn't these wars settle? Why were they fighting? I mean, I watched Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War. I had great-great-grandfather died in the Civil War, and his brother died in the Civil War. Yeah. I was curious. It's like, because I remember in school they were saying like, well, yeah, the North had everything. North was going to win, and it was just a question of time and everything. I was like, I wonder if that's true, and it wasn't true. So I started reading, and then I thought, these general principles, we should be settling these wars. And, maybe if I simplify the stories and tell them in a coherent way where you're not just reading a history book that has too much information that you don't want to know, maybe that would be useful. And so that's how I got into it.
That's interesting. And that was actually one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, you not really being like a traditional historian, writing somewhat of a history book, but coming more from like the litigation and mediator background. Like how does your experience in that shape the way that you told the stories in the book?
Yeah, in being a mediator, I have to listen to both sides. I get briefs from both sides. And as I say, for many years, I would sort through thousands and thousands of pages of documents and try and turn it into coherent stories, because I would go to an insurance company and say, or a corporation and say, look, this is what it's all about. I know it's complicated, but here's what you need to know and here's what you don't need to know. Because these people who are making these $1 million decisions, they're super busy. They want to look at something, get the information, act on it. And so I learned through experience what they liked and what they didn't like. So when I was reading about history and I decided to write the book, I said, I'm just going to try and put in the stuff that really means something.
Yeah.
Dates aren't that important. People aren't that important, a few. But let's show how it all fit together. And I actually have talked to two historians who both liked the book. And one of them said it captures the sweep of history. That's what one of them said. And the other one said it's history from a different perspective. And it's very interesting because you don't usually see descriptions of wars where they're telling you, hey, how can we avoid this in the future?
Yeah.
And where did they make the mistakes that made things get worse instead of settling or resolving the dispute? So that's how I got into it.
And that's definitely something they don't talk about in classrooms, at least from my own experience. Like, you don't hear about that stuff.
I think it's complicated, and I think there's multiple reasons for it. One of them is that the government doesn't necessarily want you to know what really happened. Mm-hmm. The current government, whoever that is, doesn't matter who's in power. They want you to know America's great. They want you to vote for them. And everything that you get is sort of filtered through that. Nobody in a high school class is going to teach you about all the wrongful things that American leaders did in these wars. They really not. They're going to teach you who's a traitor, but they won't say who was stupid. Okay, that's basically it.
We could really use that help today.
Yeah, exactly. So what I've tried to do here is you can read about these wars, and the book is not that long, so maybe 70, 80 pages for each war, the Civil War, Revolutionary War, Vietnam War. Yeah. You can read that and kind of really know, hey, this is what it was all about, and this is how it ended. And how did each side do after it ended? That's really important. I never heard that in high school, like, we fought the war, but it was really terrible for a long time. Mm-hmm. And this is so relevant today with Ukraine and Russia and the Israel and Palestine problem. It's like we're living this now. What can we do to avoid it getting worse? Really, that's what it's about. So it's really kind of serious topic, but I've tried to keep it very neutral, very to the point. And more than one person has told me that they've reread it twice because they read it once and it's a lot of information. You're talking about 3 wars in about 240 pages.
Yeah.
It's a lot of information. And because you helped me with it in terms of the audiobook.
That was definitely Jacqueline put in a lot of work.
Yeah, but and I learned too, because how do I keep it from being boring? And how do I keep it so that people understand it? And one of the key things I've learned doing any kind of analysis and reporting is keep it chronological. It's one of my big gripes with history books, is they'll tell you what happened 5 years forward, then they'll bounce back 20 years past. We're made to hear stories. We learn things in order. It's like a joke. When you hear a joke, it has to be in a certain sequence. It doesn't work. Well, I'd say the same thing is true when you hear the story of these wars.
And then you get to modern day where the punchline is.
Well, and today, I mean, the news, part of the problem of the news, they want a story every day.
Yeah.
The analysis is usually not in depth. You've got to wait for a special commentator or whatever. But they tell you about this week, last week. I want somebody to say, look, over a period of years, what did they do and how did it end up getting really bad? Because all three of these wars could have at least been settled earlier. All three, and two of them should never have been fought. So
Yeah, and that's a shame because you consider like how many lives were lost in each of these wars. It's staggering, especially by today's standards.
uncountable. Well, I think even in the Ukraine and Russia war now, we have more than 1 million soldiers that have died, I think. Certainly more than 1 million soldiers and civilians. Who knows?
Wow.
There's nobody who can count.
That is,
And the longer it goes on, the worse it is.
yeah.
And, you know, I'll just throw this in now. In the Civil War, we're talking about the Revolutionary War today, but in the Civil War, Lincoln learned you can't mess around. If you're going to win, you've got to push hard and quickly. Because the longer the war goes on, the more people die. So even though you're fighting fiercely and you're mercilessly, you end it quickly. And it ends up with less loss of life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what's the term used in military? Violence of action. You know, respond with overwhelming violence and end it. Like, yeah, lives are going to be lost, but you minimize the destruction by getting it over with quickly. And you know, if you don't pussyfoot around and come back with a soft response, you know, then I guess if you hit hard enough, the enemy does not feel compelled to respond because
They're shocked and they're quicker to give up. It's definitely true that you have to move quickly and you have to understand where you're fighting. Like in the Revolutionary War, let's take that. You've got Britain, they're 3,000 miles away. They send generals over, they send 32,000 troops, tremendous number of troops. But they're supposedly controlled by Britain. So if there's a problem, okay, let's put a letter on a ship. It's got to sail all the way over there.
Yeah.
They got to figure it out. They're going to put the letter back on the ship backwards saying, do this. Meanwhile, 6 months have passed, or 3
Right.
months at least.
Yeah.
And so, you know, they can't really keep control of what's on the ground. They had no idea, the British, of what they got into when they got into the Revolutionary War. They really had no idea.
And I was reading in your book that a lot of, like, King George and the British Parliament, like a lot of the information that they were trying to make decisions were based off of not having the full picture. Like they were withholding information for fear of embarrassment, or, you know, it was a pride.
Personal motives.
Yeah.
The subordinates have personal motives that they don't want to tell the full truth. It's going to make them look bad. And when we get to the Vietnam War, we did that in spades in our military, okay?
Yeah.
And in our government. Same thing. Nobody wants to take responsibility. The English or British, we should use Britain because that's the whole United Kingdom.
Right.
They had people who would come and go to the colonies, and they relied on them to tell them what was going on. But the head leaders, the presidents, the whatever you want to call it, the heads of the parliament, the king, they never came anywhere near. The King of England didn't even go to the north of England.
That's crazy.
Okay?
Yeah.
I mean, how nuts is that? He stayed basically in the south of England his whole life, and he's running a huge empire. So,
How do you think, do you have any speculation on how the war might have turned out had the king come over and seen for himself firsthand what was going on?
oh, absolutely. You have to understand that the French and Indian War is what we call it in the United States, although it was the War of the French or the 7 Years' War, all same name. France was fighting with England around the world, okay? Well, they wanted to also fight in America and drive the French out of America. And so they sent troops over, and not unlike us sending troops to Vietnam, right? They sent troops over and they said, okay, we want you to fight with us and we're going to get rid of the French. And the American colony people made huge profits off them because they had these soldiers there and they'd say, oh, we got to buy food. Well, everything's 3 times as much,
Yeah.
right? And they get British cash, you know, they're taking advantage. So how do the people reporting back to Britain justify that they're paying 3 times as much for everything, even though they're all British citizens? The Americans are British citizens,
Right.
and the British are British citizens. They say they don't know what they're doing. We had to give in to them. They're stupid. The Americans are dumb, and they don't want to fight either. They don't know how to fight.
That's interesting.
And of course, just like we were in Vietnam, the Vietnamese kind of sat back and let us fight.
Mm-hmm.
We did the same thing when we were colonials. Hey, Britain's got this big army. They got all these people. Yeah, we'll help you. We'll stand behind you. Don't worry.
Yeah.
And so they reported back that the Americans were cowards. Okay?
Yeah.
So the British had this idea of Americans being ungrateful cowards. Same thing with regard to taxation. We fought taxes. We threw the tea in the Tea Party. It was vandalism. We were bad. And they told that to their populace. And this is the message that got back to the leaders, that the Americans are stupid and bad.
Yeah, that was the...
Well, we can't give them what they want. That's ridiculous. We founded those colonies. We supported them. They're like children. We're like the parents. Do what I say. That was the problem. And then when they got over here, they realized, no.
It was a completely different scenario, yeah.
Well, and it took about 2 years, from 1774 to 1776. They knew the war was starting, but Britain didn't have the soldiers to send over, so they took 2 years to send 32,000 troops
Wow,
over.
that's like 2 years of regrouping and
Well, that's what the colonial
strategizing,
people
yeah.
were doing too. So that's the kind of bad information that fed that war. Now, if somebody came over and talked to the Americans and heard their gripes, that would be great. One of the things was jealousy too,
Yeah.
because the colonies were doing great.
Yeah.
They were trading with Britain. They're making a fortune. Britain was making a fortune. They were all getting rich. And the Americans in the colonies, there was no begging. There was there were nice houses. And people go back to Britain and say, it's nicer over there than it is here. Okay. So they didn't like that. Plus the British leadership didn't like the immigration, because that's how America got founded. A lot of them came from Britain.
Yeah.
And the better it got in America, the more people were leaving Britain. So if you're a landlord in Ireland, that was a big place where a lot of people came from. If you were a landlord, it's like, who's going to pay the rents on my land in Ireland if they all go to America?
Yeah, if everybody's over
So
here.
they're making all these decisions that they're going to start to try to control America now that it's so big and so strong.
You know, and that brings up an interesting point. Like, one of the things that I really enjoyed about your book was, so often in school, they frame it as this was a revolution. But in all honesty, at least the way I read it was more about preserving the way of life that was already here, that the colonists have been living with for so long. And now, you know, after decade or so, Britain tries to come in and start like instituting taxes and instituting all these rules when the colonists have already figured all this out and everything's humming smoothly.
Yeah, well, actually, it takes place over almost 100 years. In the beginning, very little trade. Britain didn't pay attention. Trade increases, population increases, and all of a sudden now, America is the 400-pound gorilla. The population of the colonies was growing 4 times greater than the population of Britain. Within 20 years, America would have more people than Britain.
Yeah.
And having population, that's how you fought wars. If you had a lot of people,
If you have more people.
You didn't have the technology that we have now.
I guess even their battle formations were kind of war of attrition type style.
Yeah, and Europe was mostly fields. It had been inhabited for a very long time. When they fought wars, you see the war movies about Europe, it's always these open fields that everybody's running through because people would farm on them and stuff. But the colonies were still very wild.
Yeah.
And this also happened in the Civil War too. You know, when people tried to fight the locals, they'd go up into the woods, they'd go up into the mountains, and you couldn't beat them up there. There was no way. You couldn't have formations. You couldn't get your soldiers there. The war of attrition, really, in a big way. If they got far away from the coast and their supplies, and they're up in the mountains, and people are shooting at them from behind trees. They're not going anywhere.
Geez, what a terrible way to fight. Like, line up in this field. We're going to shoot at each other until...
Well, part of it too was the muskets, which is what they used. They were circular musket balls, right? And those things were like knuckleballs.
They're just all over the place.
They would go all over the place. So they would line up with like 50 people. They'd shoot 50, and then these things would bounce all over and then take out the people on the other side. See? So that was one of the reasons they did it that way. You couldn't shoot for more than 50 or 100 yards without the thing just going sideways.
Yeah.
So that was part of that tactic. So, Britain was very powerful. It was the most powerful country in the world at the time of the revolution. And Spain was still powerful. They'd been very powerful before, but it actually lost their power because they got lost in bureaucracy.
Yeah.
They had so much money, but everybody worked for the king, and if you were a Spanish colony, you never heard from anybody, and they never responded to anything. So they really didn't develop trade like England did. England had a parliament for about 100 years before the Revolutionary War. Before that, the kings just decided what to do, and it was ruining the country because the king would go fight a fight and use up all the money, and they would lose. And the people would be like, what's this all about? And the lords and so forth, they got together and they forced, it's called the Glorious Revolution, the end of 1600s. And that now the king had to work with Parliament, which was good because you had
some check and balance.
You had people talking. It allowed the dissent. You could have competing ideas. And so there was a very smart leader, Robert Walpole, in Britain in 1720. And they were always trying to call us, America got more prosperous. They were always trying to say, well, maybe we should get more taxes out of them, just like any government does. They're looking for places to get money. And Robert Walpole was like, it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
And he basically was able to overcome the people, him and his followers for almost 40 years. They left the Americans pretty much alone. They tried to do stuff, they didn't really enforce it. The Americans' lives weren't really affected. But when Walpole retired and his followers lost power,
Yeah, shit went to hell.
new young guys came in. And Parliament basically was 200 families that controlled Parliament. And if you weren't the oldest son stayed with the estate. But if you were a middle son or a younger son, you went into government. So what I would compare it to is there were a lot of Hunter Bidens running the government.
Oh my God.
Okay, that's how I would put it. They drank, they womanized, they gambled, and they wanted more money from wherever they could get.
Oh, well,
So
at least they didn't have laptops back then.
Right. So as it started to go bad, there were still other voices that came in and said, no, don't destroy the American trade. We're all getting rich.
Yeah.
What are you doing? This is nuts. Again, they had the thought that the Americans were stupid and the war would be over quickly. Everybody thinks the war is going to be over quickly, and it never is, right?
Yeah.
They think it's going to be over quickly. And then a guy named Edmund Burke, one of the lords, right before the war started, he said, what are you doing? He gave a very impassioned speech to Parliament that the trade is worth more than anything. We don't have to control the Americans. All the Americans wanted was some degree of control of their own taxation. Either no taxation of all would have been fine, or give us representation in England or something. But give us something, because otherwise we're being slaves to you. We're slaves, and we don't want to be your slaves. Or at least we're second-class citizens, because we're British citizens too.
Yeah.
That's the message. So Edmund Burke made his argument to Parliament, and they voted 278 to 70 go to war.
Jeez.
I mean, so you can tell them the truth. And we were talking about this before, the idea that nobody wants to listen to the truth.
Yeah.
You could tell them the truth, but they didn't want to hear it. And a lot of people don't know that, but in 1776, the war started, right? 1778, the British leader said, ooh, big mistake. And they went to the Americans and said, we'll give you that. We've decided we'll give it to you. No taxation, whatever you wanted. We want to get back together. But by then, the Americans had made a deal with the French, who were supporting them. The French were the enemies of Britain. The French kings, they were like, we don't like England, we'll help you. And so they couldn't undo it at that time.
And I think correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was the French that really started providing the first semblance of military instruction and military training, right?
Well, the French and Indian War had actually trained a lot of the American militias, the colonial militias, to fight because they were fighting on the side of the British. So they were able to see how the British did it. Then when the French became involved, they gave supplies. Lafayette came over. They really helped the colonies in a tremendous way, and the war would not have ended the same way without the French influence. But it's really important to remember, again, this shows you the relevance to today's events,
Yeah.
that because the French borrowed money to fund the Americans, they starved their own people over the next 20 years, and their own people rebelled, and you had the French Revolution, where they got rid of all the kings. And at the same time, before the Revolution, when the Revolutionary War ended, the British were extremely generous to the Americans, said, we want to make a deal with you for future trade. And they gave all kinds of things. The trade, they gave huge quantities of land to the Americans, all this stuff. And the Americans went for the deal with the British. And the French are sitting there going, we just helped you win this war. We supported you for how long? And now you're going to go have most of your trade with Britain and not us? And it's exactly what happened. So we weren't very grateful to the French for their help in the Revolutionary War.
Wow. So they were our allies, and then we turned against them on the...
Because it was a better deal. It was just, it was practical. But you look at what's going on in the Ukraine now, and it's kind of similar. We're throwing money at the Ukraine, and how's it going to end? We don't know how it's going to end. Maybe Ukraine will end up making a deal with somebody else when it's all done. We don't know. And I have lots of Ukrainian friends. I like the Ukraine. I'm just saying you don't know what's going to happen. And right now, America hasn't got a balanced budget, and we're borrowing money to give to another country to fight their war, which is just what the French did in the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, well, and hopefully a lot of that's starting to come to an end now.
I hope.
Getting things under control and exposing where a lot of corruption is and stuff. But we'll see if it sticks. I mean, this is happening now, and 5-6 years from now will be the true test, I think.
Yeah, the future is extremely hard to predict. That's one thing I've learned from all this reading. Luck plays a big factor in everything. Like I would say in the Ukraine war, from what I know, nobody expected that Zelensky would be able to take power and run things and successfully defend the country. And he did. That was totally unpredictable to the Russians. No one expected it in Russia, particularly. And, that's people are luck. One person,
Yeah, and I guess with some of the stuff that's coming out now, it makes me wonder, like, how much, like, there was a lot of underground support that got him to that place. And we probably talk about the Ukraine conflict all day. But
that's it. I don't know enough about it to talk about it with the kind of knowledge that I can talk about these wars, because they already happened and they're well documented, and there's nothing controversial in what I'm writing about. I'm really trying to get the clearest view of what happened without taking sides. Now you're in the middle of a conflict. Anything we say or do could affect this war. You don't know what phrase might affect something.
Yeah. Now, wasn't after the American Revolution, when schools, what they teach in schools, it's almost like, okay, we had a revolution against the British, won our independence, and everything was great after that until the Civil War. But that's not the case. Like, things were not really easy once we broke free from British rule.
No, exactly. And that was sort of the punchline of my research was all three of these wars, the people would have been better off if they never fought them.
Yeah.
Civil War, the South, there was no way to settle with them early, so you had to fight. You didn't have a choice, really. But yeah, after the Revolutionary War, remember the colonials were upset that the British were going to tax them. Mm-hmm. That's what this was all about, British control. Well, during the war, per capita income went down 50% for 7 years. And then for the next 40 years, America was in tough shape. The new country was in very tough shape because they had, up to that time, they didn't have to pay for their own military defense because they were part of Britain. They knew that Britain would come be the police force. No defense budget.
And now they're footing the bill for everything.
Yeah, and also, you know, talk about luck. The luckiest thing about America is the people who wrote the Constitution, the people who were in power after the war. They were relatively young. When you
Yeah.
look at the age of these guys, there's 20s, 30s, 40 was an old one. You know, Benjamin Franklin was the oldest, but he was an outlier. You
He
know?
was a geezer at
Yeah.
like 30 years old.
Yeah, exactly. So these young guys get together. They just wanted to have the same life they had before. Okay, we won. We beat the British. Now what? So 1783, they formed the Articles of Confederation for the 13 colonies, and it's a disaster. Okay, because each of the colonies is acting like its own little country.
Yeah.
And they're making deals with other countries, some good, some bad. There was a lot of protectionism going on. We're going to prefer our citizens of our state to the citizens of the state next door. Okay, so that was trouble. They also ran into the problem of demagogues. They ran into people who would say, go with me, I'll give you everything you want. And one of the big arguments of the demagogues in some of these states was cancel all debts. We're going to start fresh in America. And of course, that appeals to all the debtors,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, not the people that actually.
Yeah. Well, and the trouble with canceling debts is it breaks down the structure of society.
Yeah.
Because if they cancel the debts, the people who loan, they're thinking, well, the British loaned us money. No, the wealthier Americans loaned us money. Now we're going to take away from them. So it was a mess. And then these guys, the founding...
That is so interesting because you see that playing out in recent times. I mean, just look at the previous administration. And
Well, the school loan thing.
yeah.
And I understand that the government was kind of complicit in some of those schools getting students that shouldn't have even been approved as schools, and now you're handing the students all those loans. I understand that issue. But it's very hard to cancel loans when you don't cancel it for everybody.
Yeah.
What about the poor people who saved and didn't even take out loans and paid their own cash, you know? So that was a demagogue move by Biden, really. It was, I'm going to give you something for free, vote for me. And you can't run a country that way.
Yeah, somebody's got to pay.
Somebody's got to pay. And the reason that America was successful was they recognized the problems. They were all well-educated farmer businessmen types, and they knew business. And they said, we have to put in a structure where everything works. So that's how we got the balance of powers. But they were also, Alexander Hamilton, very powerful financial system put in place, also with checks and balances.
Yeah.
And the financial system is what saved the country. But, you know, there were people at that time talking about, let's have our own king, or, you know, it's like, now what? Now what do? We got rid of the British, you know, we have to start from scratch.
Now we got to figure this out.
And you figure out that not only did they do it, but there was never any kind of internal revolution until 80 years later with the slavery issue and the Civil War.
Yeah.
So it lasted for 80 years that way, and America became incredibly prosperous after 1812 up until the Civil War. I mean, it continued to prosper right after the Civil War too, but that's another story. We'll do that in another broadcast. As far as what happened financially, it was terrible. And Britain, let me just check my notes so I have this.
Yeah.
The amount of money that Britain made would have made, if they were successful in attacking the colonials, was 100 times less than they actually lost in fighting the Revolutionary War. Okay?
Wow.
Yeah, because they spent half their economy on the Revolutionary War for 7 years, half of the economy of Britain. Killed trade, people unemployed in Britain, all that kind of stuff. It was just awful. They lost, the British, or the British in America was 2.5 million people. They were no longer British subjects. Okay, you still value the power of a country by the number of subjects it has. They lost 43,000 soldiers. They gave the Americans huge amounts of land after the war because they wanted to stop the Americans from manufacturing too much. The British had a big manufacturing basis to their economy, and they were very much afraid of the Americans. One of the reasons they fought the war, they didn't want the Americans to just overpower them. So they wanted to hinder manufacturing after the war, and they gave huge quantities of land, enormous, and the hope was that the Americans didn't know how to handle it.
Like
That's why
managing that
they,
much.
they didn't manage it. Remember, there are other colonial powers out there waiting to pounce.
Yeah.
France could have come out, certainly Spain, Russia, Sweden. These were all people who were trying to colonize. Everybody was colonizing the whole world at that time from Europe. So
It's interesting that they don't consider something like this actually a world war because it had global impact.
oh, absolutely, absolutely. The war with the French was a world war. I mean, it went from the Philippines. There's a section in the book where I talk about how they resolved it, and I don't want to give all the details, but they traded countries like we trade monopoly hotels and stuff. I mean, they were just, you take this one, I'll take that one, they do it. You could have these 4 islands in the Caribbean, we'll take the Philippines.
Yeah.
You know, oh, Florida, that goes over here.
One is amazing too in Britain, like one of the most powerful organizations was corporate empires, East India Trading Company.
Well, yeah, they had their trading companies because they didn't want to tax the people and they didn't want to run it with their own bureaucracy. It was so much cheaper to make everybody who was in a colony sink or swim, and let them do it on their own. And that's how do you come in after 100 years and say, yeah, you did really good, guys, but we're taking it now. You know, people are not going to stand for that. And then a lot of people don't know that they lead up, like the Boston Tea Party and the rest of it, it was really a class war. Where the merchants were mostly the people who were most affected by the taxation because it was all tariffs. Basically, These were all tariffs, so there wasn't an income tax. And the merchants were the most aggressive in fighting. And they tended to use people who were unemployed, lower class, laborers on their side. And once they really decided that they were not going to make it with England a few years before the war actually started, if you were somebody who favored siding with Britain, they'd burn down your house.
Man, that's gangster.
It was gangster. One of the things the British government relied upon said, well, most of the people in America don't want to rebel. Most of them are happy. They're going to fight with us in this war.
Yeah.
Well, no, they got driven out. They were afraid to speak because they were afraid that they'd be hurt or all their property would be destroyed. Remember, there's no safety net here for anybody in the world.
No
There's
regulation. Everybody's
Social
just
Security.
figuring it out.
Yeah. So if somebody burns down your house and everything you own,
You got to rebuild a house from scratch.
yeah, and it wasn't easy, you know, for these people. So the wealthy in America, the wealthy colonials were very pro-British. The people in the middle of the road were like, God, we don't want to fight. We don't want a war with Britain. They got the strongest army and navy in the world. Why would we want to fight with them? But the merchants kind of drove it. And then the British played into their hands. Because at the same time, the Americans are saying, the merchant class is saying they're making us into slaves and they're trying to take over our country. The British were going, do what you tell us. Do what I tell you to do. Do it. You know, we're not going to talk with you. We're not going to negotiate. And again, they were sort of the Hunter Biden types. So the colonials, after a while, even the people who are middle of the road, like, yeah, we can't really stay with them. They're just not acting in our best interest.
Well, I think historically it almost seems like King George III is portrayed as somebody who's not completely with it. Do you think that's accurate, or do you think he suffered from just lack of information?
I think it's a combination of the two. He was very bright. From the time he was made king, he relied on his ministers. So it was a personality thing. It was a personality thing. He was sort of a whiner. So they'd get into
himself with the wrong people.
Yes. And he would get into meetings and he would say, I want to do this. And they would say, no, you should really do that. And they were older, and he became very young. They were older, and then they would come back after it all went to hell with what they had recommended. And he would say, I told you so. You know, I told you so. I was right all along. But he would never assert that power himself. He would never say, you're wrong, you're doing it my way now. He didn't do it. He would make his arguments and he'd sit back. And so he let his ministers control the country, although he went through ministers quickly. He'd fire somebody if it turned out badly, but then with the next minister, it would be the same thing. So they could manipulate him. He was manipulatable. And so other people were really running Britain other than the king.
Yeah, that's almost an interesting observation on like human behavior and human psychology, because there's a lot of folks that, in some ways, it's a number of factors, upbringing or whatnot, but in some ways would prefer to not really get involved, say a little bit, and then step back and let it all burn down, and then be like, well, hey, I told you this was going to happen. But
Exactly.
had you asserted yourself a little bit as it was happening and what you thought you believed, like, you could change the outcome of people's lives, quite literally.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the power of the individual, whoever's in power. And if you're, that's why the subheading of the book is, what is it? Lessons in leadership as well.
Yeah.
If you have a powerful leader, things can happen. George Washington was certainly a powerful leader, and that's one of the reasons why it worked. He was sensible. He made money after the war, and I guess during the war, because he was also a speculator, and people went after him for that a little bit, but they were so glad to be free of Britain that nobody paid much attention to that. But Britain didn't really have good people leading the government at that time, and then when it turned around, when they realized they were going down the completely wrong track in Britain, then they got Lord North, and Lord North was the one who was so generous that nobody could believe it, that he got this deal together for the Americans. And the British population was furious. After fighting this war for 7 years, now you're going to give them more than they ever asked for? The people were not happy.
Wow.
But you know what? Trade immediately picked up. And all of a sudden, everybody was employed again, the money was flowing again, the work was going again, and they all forgot about it.
Yeah.
So it was a very smart move, really, by Lord North, because he knew that the British couldn't control America.
Yeah. So it's better to just kind of work with them. And I mean, America had all these raw resources that Britain needed.
Yeah. And you got to understand, just generally, that the New World was seen as a place for exploitation. We haven't talked about Native Americans because it's not really part of this. How do we stop the wars? But I mean, they were just victims.
Yeah.
And it was a question of who would bother them the most. The French had been the best in the sense that they were willing to coexist with the Indians. They didn't Native Americans, I should say. They didn't displace them. So they lived together. When the British came in, they were very much, these are our boundaries. We're moving in. Go away. Mm-hmm. And so the British weren't very popular with the Native Americans. And then of course disease and everything else came into it as well.
Yeah.
But it was all just a question of which European power was going to carve up America and in what way. And the genius of the founding fathers ultimately led to America being from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean,
Yeah.
which gave us two huge borders that we didn't have to work hard to defend. And
It's that manifest destiny.
yeah, well, but that was politically like an extremely important thing, and and that was luck too. That was luck too. I mean, we could have three separate countries here, and we could have a country run by basically another power, whoever. With the Rocky Mountains or something, who knows? It's much harder to defend against wars when you don't have great borders like that. But that's
strategically, it's amazing that it worked out that way.
Yeah, that's luck. It really was luck and good design by the founding fathers, and then people along the way, including Lincoln, was very much instrumental in that as well.
And that was this is kind of leading into the Civil War a little bit, but I know one of the big sticking points with the Civil War has to do with slavery. Was slavery rampant during the Revolution times? Or was that a result of all of the economic downfall after the war that things picked up?
It's really important to understand slavery for the Revolutionary War and going forward too. The slavery first started in the Caribbean. I'm calling American slavery. The slavery's been everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
But
it's just common practice back then.
When the people first discovered America and the Caribbean and so forth, they realized they could raise sugar there. And that became a big business for the British and the French. And it was terrible conditions down there. Malaria. They tried using Native Americans, and the Native Americans just were unwilling to work hard, and they died. They literally, it didn't work out. They couldn't stand the hot temperatures. Even when they brought over the slaves from Africa, I think after 5 years, 20% had died. That was the thing between malaria and working in the heat and poor conditions. So you're losing 20% of people in these businesses. And these businesses talk about a high risk job. When in the 1700s, they started saying, hey, maybe we can use slaves in parts of the country that are not so
a little more temperate.
Temperate, not as bad with disease. So they, primarily the Carolinas, Virginia, tobacco, rice, indigo, they could grow all these things. But the part of the problem was that a lot of the planters left the Caribbean to come here. And remember, those people, they would be what we would call like the financial people, the whatever. They were in business to make money. They weren't trying to found a country. They owned this. They were trying to operate it for maximum profit, and they didn't care about human life. They really didn't. And a number of these families and people moved into the South, and they wanted to run it the same way because that was the most profitable way to run it. So the trouble with that was the north of America, it was mostly religious people who ended up in Massachusetts and New York and New England and so forth. So the climate wasn't suited to slavery. The people were religious and felt that everybody had to work, that it was sinful not to work.
Yeah.
And so you had these two sections of the country growing with ever increasing immigration who had completely different views on how the world was supposed to work. And that's ultimately what led to the clash in the Civil War. Now, in the Revolutionary War, to get the 13 colonies together, you had to, if you're going to put together a country, you've got to get everybody to agree.
Yeah.
And slavery was the big sticking point because the South was not going to give up slavery. It's where they made their money.
And that was the reason why Washington conceded on that point initially, was just to help unify things.
Yeah, well, everybody was afraid that, the war with Britain was over, but we don't have an army. We don't have any way to tax the people.
Yeah.
We don't have any money. And there are all these other colonizing powers out there. We're weak now. Maybe Britain will come back next year and try and take us over again.
Financially, they were weak. And
Yeah, so the colonies understood that they had to have some way of operating. And as I said, they were operating like a bunch of 13 independent countries. And then they recognized that we're never going to survive if we don't get together in one country with a strong federal government that can maintain an army, that can, collect taxes and things like that. We need that to survive. And that's how he ended up with it. And the question is, okay, if you had said to the South, no, we're not going to allow slavery, and you had two smaller countries, both would have been much more vulnerable. You'd already be breaking up.
Would have been New France and New Britain.
Yeah, and who knows what we would have ended up with. It's really not foreseeable. So they come up with a 3/5 solution that if you had a slave that gave you 3/5 of, his vote was worth 3/5 of a non-slave, that kind of compromise. And of course, that's what led to the Civil War later. But they had to put it into place after the Revolutionary War. There was no political way to do it otherwise. And it was all about, we've got our new country, we want to protect our way of life. We're just going to let things stay the way they are for now.
Yeah, and that's interesting how, like, historically things like that work out. Like, you got this horrible human condition, but, to do away with it at that point, like, America wouldn't even exist today.
Yeah, and it had to come from other places too. Remember, we're in a world, and in Britain, they kind of understood it. The French were tougher. French were slower to do it. But the British outlawed slavery, like 1832 or something. We outlawed importation at some point. I'll get into that in our next podcast. But Britain led the way, and Britain paid off the people who owned slaves. They paid them off. They just said, no more slavery, and we're going to pay you for the slaves. And then before the Civil War, well before the Civil War, Lincoln floated that same idea as a relatively young politician. Nobody wanted to do it. Nobody in America wanted to spend the money that it would cost to free the slaves. And instead, we paid the cost of the Civil War, which again was huge.
What I thought was interesting is, the world is watching this. Even back then, when like lines of communication are like 6 months long across the ocean, the world's watching. Slavery is already kind of in, most civilized countries is thought of as a blight on humanity, even though it existed like very much so. And Lincoln leveraged that to prevent other countries from getting involved in the Civil War because, or at least the way I understood it, I think you covered some of this in the book and how Spain didn't get involved, maybe France to a lesser degree because they didn't want to be on the wrong side of the slavery issue.
You have to understand the change in America even after the Revolutionary War and before the Civil War. After the War of 1812 in particular, between 1860, America just exploded. And it was basically the Industrial Revolution that did this. So we had the Erie Canal, which was dug in the 1820s.
That's crazy.
And connected the Great Lakes. But once you got the railroads and you got the manufacturing going, America just drew people like mad. So there was immigration from all over. And America wanted immigration. Again, it was security. The more people we have in our country, the more stable we're going to be. And that forced the issue because the North had all the water power. It had elevation, and everything was run by water power at that time. So if you had your little inventions at the Industrial Revolution, now you got to power them. You need the water. The South didn't have the water. They had slower flowing rivers that didn't drive mills like the North did. So the population of the North increased dramatically compared to the South.
That's interesting.
And so the people in the South are like, what are we going to do? We're losing our power. And it was especially because of so many people coming into the North and the abolitionist factions in the North who were really pushing to end slavery. They kept making more and more noise about it, trying to get it ended. And the people in the South are like, we're going to be outvoted. We're going to be done. We better do something.
Yeah.
We can't wait. That's really what drove it. So it's really immigration and the Industrial Revolution, which changed America in 80 years to the point where the South said, no, we're going to do it our way, and we don't care if we have to fight to leave, that kind of thing. So, I mean, I understand that. They still had this same economy, but that was a very profitable economy. They didn't want to lose it. That's all.
Yeah, that makes sense. You gotta survive.
And they were the people, who had come from the Caribbean. They were the people who came to make the big money.
Yeah.
And we hear the word oligarchy a lot lately, but they were the oligarchs. The planters had all the money, they had all the land, and they wanted to run it their way. So.
And ultimately it came down to control and power.
Yeah.
Staying centralized within those families and.
Right. And no willingness to recognize that slavery had to end. In fact, they were trying to extend it more and more. I mean, it's complicated, but, that was a collision course there between the loss of power due to the population in the North and also the potential loss of a way of life.
Yeah. So I had some questions here about this. Well, was there more that we wanted to cover in the Revolutionary War period?
I've got some things. Let me just check my notes. Well, Britain always wanted to divide and control the colonies. That's not really new news. Let's see. We covered a lot of stuff already. That's good. The Loyalists. That's a really big deal. We talked a little bit about that.
Yeah.
But the British, again, when they fought the war, they didn't fight the war very smart in that they wanted the loyalists to fight for them, but when they negotiated, they ignored the loyalists. So they were very much afraid of the colonial militias executing British soldiers. And it was really if you were psychopathic about it, it was in the interest of the colonials to do this because the British soldiers could only be replaced from 3,000 miles away after somebody requested it. So if you took out a British soldier, that was good for 6 months.
They're out for 6 months, yeah.
Exactly. So the British made a deal with the colonials. Look, we'll have prisoner exchanges. You're going to capture prisoners. We're going to capture prisoners. We'll have exchanges. They never negotiated on behalf of the loyalists. So the colonials would kill the loyalists because they had no reason not to. Okay? So what did the loyalists do? They left. They went to Canada quickly.
Yeah.
So that was a way British lost people who could have been fighting for them if they wanted to keep them. Because they really didn't care. You know, this is part of that whole British thing. They were thinking, it's just us, and we're going to do it our way, and we don't care about anybody but ourselves.
So basically, the colonials drove out anybody that was sympathetic to Britain, just to preserve the way of life of what became America.
And then during war, you said, oh, is he a spy? Is he a spy for the British? Are they spies? And by the way, they have a nice house and a lot of money because the loyalists were more likely to be better off financially. So, you know.
You could definitely see the problem there.
Exactly. Well, I mean, and you can see, even in our government today, you can see the worries. The worries are, there are a lot of people who are unhappy and don't have what they want. And it wouldn't take much. They know it wouldn't take much to get this uprising here, that uprising there, whatever. And they don't want to do that. They're smart enough, and we're smart enough because we have the opportunity for dissent. We have the opportunity to make this recording. We can say what we want.
Yeah.
So
without getting thrown in prison.
Right, and we can get the word out there. It also gives people ideas to make the right decisions. So
seems like Britain's going backwards a little bit today in that regard.
There's no doubt. I think if I was going to pick the one thing that concerns me is there's a real emphasis on caring and feeling and humanism. And I like all of those things. I think they're wonderful. But you can't run countries based on, I feel bad for somebody, so I'm going to do something because I feel bad for him. You can't run on that. You have to have a system that works, that rewards the people that rewards the systems that provide the goods. You've got to have a system that works. And it seems to me that there's a lot of emphasis on this caring and feeling and whatever without recognizing this country survives because of all those definite mathematical hard systems that work, the rule of law, all this stuff. That's why we survive. And you can go out and care and feel as much as you want, but they're going to come for you. The people from the other parts of the world that want your stuff, they're going to come for you.
This is an interesting case study. Like, it's been going on for, as long as I can remember. But, it's interesting case study in how, intentions that seem noble on the surface can really get perverted and sinister, like if left unchecked. Like, always do what's best, from a humanity perspective. But, there's some common sense things that come into play that, some people just aren't, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Like, some people cannot be reformed.
Right.
Like, cultural differences are very difficult when you put two opposing cultures directly in contact with each. That's just human nature. Yeah. And you see a lot of that playing out.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. It is human nature. And the founders, if you think about the checks and balances system, they anticipated that politicians would be crooked. They anticipated that any branch of the government, you could have a president who's a dictator, you could have a judiciary that goes wild. Mm-hmm. They anticipated all this because they understood that people will not behave badly or will behave badly if they don't have structure around them. Not everybody, but a substantial number will behave poorly if there's no limits on them. They just can't control themselves. And like one of my pet peeves is people relying on songs like John Lennon's Imagine. Imagine there's no war and we're all together and we're all happy and everything. Yeah, you can imagine all you want, but that's not people.
It's not real. I mean, it's not like that in nature.
No.
You know, we're a reflection of nature. Like
Yeah,
that's,
it's competitive. Everybody wants good stuff. Everybody. You
Yeah.
know, and we're lucky here. We have this great government. We have a chance to have great jobs, do stuff like we're doing today. But look at people in half the world who have no such opportunity. You know?
Well, and there's always going to be somebody that's going to take advantage of the situation. And I think that's where the reform issue comes in, is like you have people in positions of power that, you know, there's a noble idea with the intention of helping folks. And then somebody steps in, kind of adopts that idea, gets a lot of people on board, and then whether it's money or something else, like that doesn't actually go to help the actual issue. Instead, it lines the pockets of
Yes.
people that are taking advantage of that
Right.
whole situation.
It's a scam. There's no question. And I always fight with this because I don't want to be so hard-hearted that I'm not charitable or giving charity. But you also want to give charity where it belongs. You don't want to be a sucker. Let me throw in a little aside. I know someone well who emigrated to the United States from one of the Baltic countries that was under communism. And this was fascinating to me. I had never thought about it before. But in the Soviet Union, there's no charity. You can't do charity in the Soviet Union. It's so contrary to America, which is the most charitable country in the world. And you know, we have the Red Cross, whatever. A lot of countries in the world are charitable. But the idea in Russia is the government knows best. So if you have extra money, you give it to the government. We'll decide who gets it. Okay? So
It's not a good recipe.
Exactly. And you know, so people are literally afraid to do anything that might be construed to be the role of the government. You have
Interesting.
your job, you have your thing, but if you're giving away charity, you know, we know where the money should go.
You know,
You're smarter than me.
What's interesting about that, though, is that we're kind of on that same track here in America for a while. And, well, and then as you see things being uncovered, it's like, oh, well, yeah, the government doesn't know what's best with our money.
Well, you have high taxes, and it appears very little accountability about how the government spends it. And so there's going to be bad actors who end up with that money in their pockets. I mean, I'm fascinated by the people who scammed COVID. I'm just fascinated.
Colossal.
And I know in the medical system, too, I don't know if this is still true, but it used to be that places like Medicare would pay. They would never not pay. They would pay, but then they would chase you later, which I thought was really stupid. Like if you're going to steal money from Medicare, they're not going to really stop you or look closely at you, but they'll try and get it back from you after you've spent it. You know, it's a crazy system, but we're asking government to do too much. I think that's what it is.
Absolutely, yeah. I think big government, it's too far removed from the day-to-day problems of the people. And then, well, there's actually, do you remember Successories? They were like these motivational posters that would come out, like
I don't remember, but go ahead and tell me about it.
well, so there's a company called despair.com, and it was kind of like a play on Successories, but there's one that comes to mind. It was a beautiful picture of the Capitol building, and it just said government, and then underneath that it said, if you think our problems are huge, wait until you see our solutions.
Yeah. That's the Ronald Reagan line. You know, the scariest words on earth are "the government is here to help you." You know, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So
I actually think there's a news clip of Kamala Harris saying those exact words. I forget where it was, Haiti or something. But
no, it's a crazy world, and we have to go at it. I strongly believe getting the best minds together
yeah.
to solve the problems and pick the problems, not focus. Everybody wants good stuff. I mean, not just for themselves. They want good stuff for the country. Everybody. So, you know, can't we get together and try and focus on that Because the fight is usually, well, how do we get there? I want to get there this way, and I want to get there that way. Can't we pick the best of both? I mean, it's all about dialogue, and too often it descends into name calling, or calling people evil, having evil motives or whatever. It's usually not that at all. I hope. I mean, we're finding out there's some pretty
Well,
good
I mean, this
stuff going
is
on.
what you do, right? Like, this is kind of your profession in mediation, and I'm sure you see this play out time and time again in all kinds of situations.
Yeah, and we try and solve it. The whole idea is there may be problems, but the cost of fighting to everybody involved and financially is much greater than if we just figured out a way to solve it.
Yeah.
And I do that on a daily basis, and it's very, very rewarding, because I worked on lawsuits for years and years and years on single lawsuits, crazy. And then when you get as a mediator, if they present you with the situation, the earlier the better, and you're able to solve it, it just makes you feel like so good that you save so much waste from a fight that didn't have to happen this way. And war is exactly the same way. We need to sit down and talk. I mean, I think Trump is doing the right thing. He's a real negotiator. I think people misapprehend how good a negotiator he is.
Yeah.
I heard this morning, just to put a date stamp on this, that he said to both Russia and the Ukraine, he says, nobody's really serious about settling, and if you don't, do something serious quickly, I'm just getting out of it.
We're out of it.
We're out of it. Yeah. And that's what you do as a mediator. You can't force people to settle. You try and show them the way to get there. And basically he said that. If you really want to settle this, you better do something now or I'm out.
Yeah, we're not going to enable you to continue.
Right, we're not going to go on for months and months and months. And that's sometimes you have to do that because one side or the other has a benefit for dragging it out for whatever reason it is. And without Trump there, if I'm them, either side, I'm like, uh-oh, we better get serious now. We better try to do something. So I thought that was a smart move by him this morning. Keep our fingers crossed that it works. But there's bad luck around everywhere, good luck around everywhere. You don't know what tomorrow may bring. So let's try and eliminate the conflicts we can when we can eliminate them.
Absolutely. So when you think about like what's going on today, and we take a look back in time at how things played out in previous wars, American Revolution being one of them. And then even what you do in mediation and litigation and stuff, is there anything that comes to your mind that seems to be like the number one contributor to that prevents like a peaceful settlement or conclusion to whatever the conflict is?
I think that good leaders are required, because if you've got a really bad leader, you can cast pearls before the swine, but if you've got a really bad leader, they're very hard to deal with.
Like bad in what sense?
Acting against the leader's own self-interest and the interest of his country or her country. I think that's trouble. But I do think it's all information primarily. And one of the biggest things I do as a mediator is I make the arguments that the other side is making in a persuasive way to their opposition to say, do you see what could happen? They have a valid reason here, just like the colonial Americans had a valid reason not to have British control. And if that could have been gotten over to the British people and the British leadership, that would have stopped that war from happening. And I mean, they would have been powerhouse. If they had stayed together and not fought that war for 50 years, total powerhouse. That was just really a bonehead move by the British based on misinformation that they had.
Squandered.
I also want to say, I just thought of something else that's very relevant to today. We have this whole issue of tariffs going on. Should we switch to a system where we're raising a lot of tariffs and so forth? Before the Revolutionary War, we did sort of the same thing. And it was called non-importation. And all the colonies got together about 10 years before the war, maybe 8 years before the war. And they said, we got to get Britain's attention. So we're not going to trade with them. We're not going to buy any British goods, period. We're just stopping. Now, it's hard to do because there were all these American merchants that were also selling to the British. But things had gotten bad enough that they decided to do that. And it was successful because the lack of trade affected the incomes of the British subjects, who were the people who voted for Parliament.
Yeah.
It shut down factories in Britain, a lot of financial loss, a lot of bankruptcies and things like that. And the British realized, oh my God, without American trade, we're getting killed.
That is so fascinating, even early on in our history, that
They did it. And then it kind of slid back after about a year, because some of the states, you had 13 separate states, some of them started selling back or buying, doing trade again.
Yeah.
And then it gradually went back to that. But it taught the Americans that if they stuck together, they could accomplish something with Britain. And then the follow-up to that is the reason we had the Boston Tea Party. Why was it all about tea? Well, Britain knew that if it started messing around with the American trade, it would have ramifications in England, manufacturing and stuff. But they bought a huge quantity of tea from one of their colonies in Asia. Huge amount, cheap. They said, you know what? We're going to import this to the United States. We're going to levy a tax on tea. And our tea is going to be by far cheaper than any tea they can sell themselves. And so the American housewives, they're not going to want to pay more money than they have to.
Right.
We're going to make a fortune in tea, and we'll get back some of that American trade money and stuff we want.
so it's like a trade deficit they were creating.
Yeah, well, and they knew that it would not have any ramifications in England, because it wasn't going to affect anybody's jobs in England. It wasn't like we were doing non-importation and stuff. We brought in this stuff from outside. And the American merchants were like, oh my God, this is bad, because it's really going to hit their pocketbook, because tea was so popular.
Yeah.
Coffee wasn't that popular at that
Right.
time, but tea was everything. And, what was there to do? No TV, no radio, no nothing. You had cups of tea. You sat around and talked, right? So the merchants got wind of it, and then they hired undesirables, let's call them.
Yeah.
Ruffians, longshoremen, whatever.
Ruffians, rapscallions.
Yeah, well, they dressed up like Native Americans, of course, giving the Native Americans a bad rap.
Yeah.
And they went to get the ship, or ships, I forget which, and they threw 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. And the tea was worth, at that time, $1.2 million.
In that currency?
In that time.
Oh my God, that would be like trillions today.
It was a lot of money.
Yeah.
I think I have the number right. I don't think I mixed it up. And destroyed the tea. So that's that thing that the British never anticipated. And it was basically the merchants that did it. But of course, all hell broke loose.
Yeah.
That was vandalism. Now, was the American government going to condone the vandalism? No. Were the rich people in America going to condone that? No, they're afraid that these same guys are going to take away my stuff too. I want stability. I'm doing fine. I got economic stability. I don't want to mess with that, right? So that's why the Boston Tea Party became so important. But, when I hear the Tea Party, political party, I think, well, really, it was kind of the vandalism thing. I don't know if we should have that name for it. I know that they're patriots and they were trying to protect the Americans and all that. That's fine. But certainly we wouldn't want to see it happen today in the United States, that kind of vandalism,
Oh, it definitely happened in 2020. It's
well, and you've got people burning up Tesla dealerships and stuff,
It's crazy. It is, it's
But
so
that's
crazy.
it. You don't want to encourage that in your country, because everybody suffers from that.
yeah.
So it helps nobody, and you've got to really stamp that down quickly, or it just spreads. It's foolish. We have a country where everybody can say what they want and they can vote. Thank God. And anybody who wants to resort to violence, or to suggest violence is the way out, or even to suggest somebody is evil and needs to be removed or something like that, you can't do that.
No.
That's
no.
ridiculous.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see today like how that's led to violence, just that type of rhetoric. And
Yes.
actually, me and Jacqueline were talking about just recent events, what we went through politically, and how polarized the country is, and how it's being pulled in two different directions, based on politics. But even with all that, one of the beautiful things about America is that whether you agree or disagree, a transfer of power happened peacefully. I mean, because in most other places around the world, at least where I've been, like, if you have an opposing party, then the one that's currently in power, and the one that's currently in power is doing everything they can to prevent this other party from taking it, like, that usually ends up in a lot of bloodshed, like big time, and that didn't happen here, and I think that's, I think that's awesome. Like, that's
Absolutely. And this is, everybody's got to remember, with wars, they're settled. We had the most horrible World War II ever. Millions and millions of people killed. Main enemies, Germany and Japan.
yeah,
Big allies now.
yeah,
Big allies now. It's not that long, it's not even 100 years. Big allies now. Wars get settled and people move on. The other people aren't evil. You have a disagreement. Talk to them, work it out. Because you'll see, we do the other podcast on the Civil War, the Vietnam War. You'll see that
yeah,
wars do nobody any good, neither side.
yeah. You got compromise and these are wicked problems. Like, they're not easy to solve. There's no clear answer, and there's no handbook. Like, this is all unwritten. But you can definitely see the parallels of what we're going through even today to the things that were happening back then. So I think that's where your book really does a good job of illuminating and comparing and contrasting. Like, these were the decisions that were made back then. You can very easily take the mental leap of how does that apply to today. And
I was surprised at just how detailed and complicated it was, but at the same time, it was the same kind of decisions people are making back then we're making now on a daily basis.
yeah,
It's the same dynamics of people competing for power, people competing for resources, countries competing for resources. And the world hasn't changed. And we're seeing it more now in the last year than we've seen a lot, because the order is being shaken up a little bit. And the idea of a global community where everybody just agrees to get along is gone as far as I can see. And basically you've got nations now really trying to protect their own people. And we can have alliances and we can have confederations and we can have all of this, but I don't think we'll ever be in a world where there's just one big peaceful world. It's just not going to happen.
yeah. That's just nature. There's always going to be somebody that's on the losing end. But the beautiful thing is you can structure your society in such a way that even if you find yourself at the bottom of the totem pole, you have access or the ability to move up that totem pole. And I see that here in America. Even my own experience as a child, like growing up on government cheese and living with no running water and electricity. And, we're doing pretty well today, I would think.
Well, I'll get into that more in the Civil War, but
Yeah.
this was what Lincoln was all about. He had come from nothing, and he was very anti-slavery because he felt slavery took away a person's right to the value of their work. And he had saved and he had bettered himself, and he said that's really what America gives. It gives you the right to make a better person of yourself, make a more successful person of yourself. Slavery does not do that.
Yeah.
And that's why he was so against it. So I get aggravated when I hear people saying Lincoln was a racist. He was the opposite of a racist. He was a terrific guy. And going forward, when we talk about the Civil War, we'll get a lot into those issues of how you deal with value of people and where the conflicts came from.
Yeah.
That drove the fighting. It's a fascinating story. I think the Civil War is going to be the most fascinating of the podcast. Really, I learned so much from reading about that.
Well, I think that's we'll use this as a good opportunity. Then we'll take a break real quick, and then we'll come back and dig into the Civil War if that's
I don't know if I'm up for it today. Let's take a break and see.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Bob Worden. Make sure you guys check out his book, How to Stop Wars and Save the World. Lessons in Negotiation, Settlement, and Leadership. Where can they find this book, Bob?
It's on Amazon. It's also, we did the audiobook. It's on Amazon or booksellers anywhere. It's available.
Yep, absolutely. Audiobook done right here at 10 Crow Studios. So thanks for listening, folks, and tune back in for the Civil War portion of this discussion.